What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, and on this episode, we've got a pretty loaded show for you guys heading into Week 2 in the Premier Lacrosse League. We'll talk a lot of Premier Lacrosse action heading into Week 2. Just as I said, we'll preview the matchups this weekend. We'll talk some PLL Player Royale. We'll also get into the Week 2 Picks Challenge for this week. I have a pretty solid advantage in that heading into Week 2. We'll also get your thoughts in the mix heading into Week 2, as we always like to do each and every week. And also, just a reminder to start things out here on a Thursday on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. The show is now on Stitcher platform, so you can find the show there as well. In addition to a lot of the usual places, I guess you could say, to find it, including Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn, just to name a few. You know, I always like to list those off at the end of each and every show for you guys, so make sure to follow the show on Stitcher as well. Follow the show anywhere you listen to the show on any podcast platform that we are on. We will continue to expand as we see fit as well. And make sure to comment as well on Apple as well. Leave a review on there for me as well. But before we get into this episode specifically talking a lot of Week 2 in the Premier Lacrosse League, I also want to shout out the USA vs. Athletes Unlimited game that went down last night. It was a scrimmage for the USA team heading into the Worlds, and I thought it was a really interesting game, a really interesting matchup. It was international rules, as they'll be playing throughout the event later on this month. 4 15-minute running quarters. I believe it was 10-on-10 style. I think that's what they mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, so I thought that was really interesting, seeing them go 10-on-10. I believe they also play that way in Athletes Unlimited, if I remember back to last summer. And a lot of the members of Team USA were also members of Athletes Unlimited a year ago, and a lot of those same faces should be back, it looks like, this summer for year 2 of Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse. But a couple others that I didn't see listed on their roster pool of players, if you will, on the Athletes Unlimited website. Players like Taylor Cummings played a year ago. I didn't see her name on the list for 22. She was in the game for U.S. team last night. Also, Kayla Trainer, another one that participated in Athletes Unlimited last year. Didn't see her listed on their list of participating players for this summer, but she was also present in the game, as was Kylie Ohlmiller, just to name a few. So a lot of really talented players on both sides, which I thought it was interesting. They mentioned during the broadcast of that scrimmage last night that a lot of the Athletes Unlimited players that were present in the scrimmage last night were players that were also left off the Team USA roster. So a interesting little fact there. But another fact that I thought was interesting from watching that scrimmage last night was they said that the host nation has never actually won the Worlds before, and the US is hosting it this year. It's going to be in Towson, and they are seen, at least from what they said on the broadcast yesterday, they are seen as sort of the favorites going in. So it'll be interesting to see if the U.S. can sort of set some history here by being the first host nation to ever win it. And I thought, just overall, my impressions of that scrimmage was that it was a really entertaining game. It looked like both teams played really hard, just went at it for 4 quarters. Again, a running clock for 4 quarters in that one. But both teams really looked like they got after it. They made some really spectacular plays. Even one, I forget who made the play, but one got overturned right on the crease. They said she was in the crease before letting go of the shot, but just all over the field, you saw so many great plays being made on both sides, and Athletes Unlimited really gave them a tough challenge in that scrimmage. So I'm really excited from what I saw yesterday for that Athletes Unlimited season to begin in late July, and I'll definitely try to get somebody on here on the podcast to talk about that later next month. But to jump in more specifically to the point of this episode, getting to Week 2 in the PLL, we'll go through each one of these matchups And when you look at the first game, the Chrome and the Redwoods, both teams coming in after some tough games a week ago. The Chrome came out on top in their week one matchup over the Archers. The Redwoods falling obviously to the Atlas in a bit of a tough game week one for them. And it's really interesting to me when you look at this matchup on paper, how close the matchup is statistically based upon how they played in week one. I mean, you look at both teams scored 11 points. Both had 9 1-point goals a week ago. Both shot 27%, taking 37 shots as well a week ago. But the big difference, at least on paper, from looking at this matchup is the goaltending. I mean, you look at the Redwoods, they had Tim Troutner and Jack Kelly a week ago in the cage, and they combined for just 24% in saves against the Atlas. So they'll definitely have to do better here in week two against the Chrome. And when you look at the all-time matchup here between these two, the Redwoods have the advantage all-time 2-1 in that all-time series. And I think that from what we saw a week ago, the Chrome defense looks tough. Obviously, they're healthy with guys like JT Giles Harris and Jesse Bernhardt back healthy on the defensive side of things for them. And to make things even worse for the Redwoods in this case, they'll also be without Sergio Perkovic this weekend as well, as he found his way to the injured list. So that just means that they'll have to get Nakai Montgomery more runs in this game. They'll have to get him more involved in their offense. Did have a 2-pointer a week ago against the Atlas, so they'll need to have him sort of come up a little bit faster than maybe they were hoping for because of that injury to Sergio Perkovic. And I think that for the Chrome offensively, we talked about their defense a second ago. Looking at their offense now, they need to get Jackson Morrill and Kevin Rogers more involved this weekend. They combined for 1 goal and 1 assist a week ago on 6 shots against the Archers, while a guy like Dylan Malloy really tried to at least carry that offense a week ago for the Chrome, had 2 goals on 10 shots by himself. So, like I said, for the Redwoods, it's getting Nakai Montgomery more involved now that Perkovic's out. For the Chrome, it's getting guys like Morrill and Rogers more involved, help out a guy like Dylan Malloy a little bit on their end offensively. Looking at the Chaos and the Archers, the second game on Friday night, the Chaos, I think, didn't play all that poorly against the Whipsnakes a week ago, but they definitely had their struggles offensively, and I guess you could say for good reason, considering all the guys that they had out on that side of the ball. And we'll get to a couple of roster moves that they made here on Thursday in just a second, and I thought that the Archers really looked like they were being dominated almost at times by the Chrome in week one until about that last 5 minutes. They went on a little bit of a run there. They made things interesting right at the end, but essentially just ran out of time, did the Archers. And as I mentioned before, getting to those roster moves that the Chaos made, they get Austin Stotts back from suspension. You remember back a few years ago, he had that incident with Matt Gaudette a few years ago. Both received 1-year suspensions from the league. His is now up. He's been reinstated and is now active this weekend for the Chaos on offense. They also activated Wes Berg to the active roster as well. So when you talk about that Chaos offense, now they're starting to get some pieces back in a guy like Austin Stotts, maybe a guy that we didn't really think we'd see be activated this year, but a big boost for that offense nonetheless to get a guy like Austin Stotts and Wes Berg in the rotation now. And the Archers, on the other hand, will have no Grant Ament again, more than likely this weekend with his, I believe somebody said it was a hamstring injury. So Tom Schreiber will likely stay at attack here in week two. And the Archers took 40 shots a week ago, so Blaze Reardon better be ready in the cage. Looking at the Saturday matchups, the Atlas and the Cannons to kick things off on Saturday. The Atlas had the highest goal output in week one. That's something we talked about on Monday's show. And the Cannons came in at number 2, just a goal off from the Atlas in terms of offensive goal scoring. And both defenses, I thought, played really well actually a week ago in their respective matchups. So this will be a very interesting game to see which side of the ball wins out on Saturday. Are we going to see a game that's super high scoring? The over-under on that game is 24.5. Are we going to see a game that's extremely high scoring, or are we going to see a game that's a little bit tighter? Last year they played 3 times. We'll talk more about some of those matchups a little bit later. But they did have a game that I believe was a 13-12 final, so it'll be interesting to see which end of the field wins out in this matchup specifically. But I do think the Atlas stick with Jack Kincannon in week 2. They played both Kincannon and Colarusso for a half a week ago against the Redwoods. I do think they stick with him in week 2 this week against the Cannons. And I really was impressed by what the Cannons were able to do a week ago against the Water Dogs. I thought early on, Kelly really dominated that matchup at the stripe. Withers and the Water Dogs did well to battle back and even things out a bit at the stripe as the game went along, but I really like how he came out of the gates really hot, as did their offense, just lighting it up in that first half. So I want to see what they can do against this Atlas team in week 2 in this matchup, because like I said, this is one of the more intriguing matchups, I think, in week 2, kind of similar to last week. I thought it was the Atlas and the Redwoods. I do think that this Atlas Cannons game is one of the more intriguing games of week 2. And as I said before, the Atlas definitely have the Cannons number in this matchup, going 3-0 a year ago, including a playoff win in one of those 3 games. But we talked about some of the roster moves with that Chaos Archers game. How about the Atlas and the Cannons? We'll get our first look at Bubba Fairman in the PLL this weekend. Also, Romar Dennis is active for the Atlas on Saturday as well, but still no Jake Carraway for the Atlas this weekend. So that's something that we will continue to watch for as the weeks go on. And then the final matchup of the weekend, the Whipsnakes and the Water Dogs. The Whipsnakes won late in week 1, didn't really impress me a whole lot in that game, but they came away with the win still, and the Water Dogs simply just got destroyed in that game against the Cannons. They were able to at least get the score within respectability range in that one, but I mean, you look at what happened in that first half, they were just being flat out outplayed in almost every facet of the game, especially at the stripe. As I mentioned, Kelly started out about 9 for 10, 9 out of 10 in that game. So it'll be interesting to see how they bounce back, they being the Water Dogs, and how they match up with Matt Rambo. And also on the flip side to that, how does Matt Rambo respond after a week ago going 1 for 8 shooting in that game against the Chaos? And I think for the Water Dogs, the defense just needs to be better locked in from the very start, and they can't afford to fall behind, 4, 5, 6 or more goals in the first half like they did very quickly against the Cannons a week ago. Because I think the Whipsnakes, if you give them that kind of a cushion, they're just going to take it and run. And I think on the opposite side for the Water Dogs, you look at the offense, when they did get down by those handful of goals early on, they looked offensively like they were trying to force things at time. They were trying to get it all back in one play, and that's something I talked about on Monday's episode as well. I think for them, it's if you do get behind a few goals early, don't try and force it. Just take a second, take a breath, settle the ball down, because sometimes your offense does have to be your best defense at times. Just keeping the ball away from that other team's offense can do a lot of good things for you. And then finally, I think Withers needs to be better from the start. Like I said, Kelly a week ago goes 9 out of 10 against him to start the game. So I think that Withers and the Water Dogs defense have to be ready to go from that very first whistle against the Whipsnakes, or that's where the Whipsnakes will get you. If you're not ready to play, if you're not ready to match their energy and match up with them on the field, it's going to be a long day for you. So coming up in segment 2, I want to get to some PLL Player Royale. We'll go over my strategy for this week in picking my team. I'll let you know who my team is and my reasoning behind those picks. And we'll also get the weekly picks in the PLL in the mix as well. And then we'll finish the show out by getting your thoughts to finish off heading in to week 2. But you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Segment 2 of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac as we approach week 2 in the PLL. Get some player royale as well as the picks here in segment 2. Some new tiers were released on Tuesday by the PLL on the PLL app for this week's player royale. New lineups to be set, and I definitely stayed with a few of my picks from week 1. But I also went with a couple new picks as well. And again, I saw some value there to switch things up a little bit and go with a few new faces to that lineup. And while I did go with the value picks again, they were in a different position. So a week ago, I talked about Withers at the stripe being one of those value picks as a tier 3 guy. This week, it was a different position. And I did go undefeated, in week 1 in Player Royale, and I also went 3-1, as I mentioned before, in the weekly picks. As I said, we'll get to those in just a minute. But my lineup this week for week 2 in PLL Player Royale, my attackman, I went with Jeff Teat as a tier 1 attackman, Tom Schreiber in my midfield as a tier 3 guy, Michael Earhart tier 2 defender, Trevor Baptiste tier 1 faceoff, and Blaze Reardon as a tier 2 goalie. So to kind of give a quick explanation to this lineup, or a quick rationale behind these picks, Jeff Teat I think is going to be a fantasy kind of one of those guys that you just go with each and every week, knowing that even if he doesn't have his best game necessarily, he's still going to be a great value for you. He's going to produce at a relatively high level. I believe on DraftKings this week, his over-under on points is at like 4.5 or something ridiculous like that. So obviously a guy that, like I said, week in and week out is going to be a high-level producer for you. Tom Schreiber as a tier 3 midi I think is just ridiculous. I don't know how many times you're going to see that kind of value this season from a guy like Tom Schreiber, so I went with him there. He shot 0 for 4 a week ago from that attack position that he's filling in for Grant Amon. I think now that he's a little more comfortable maybe in that role, filling in at attack for Amon, new week, new challenge, new opportunity for him. I think he comes out and bounces back pretty well and gives me some good value there as a tier 3 guy. Michael Earhart as a tier 2 defender I think has a lot of value there, especially his ability to get out and transition a bit and make things happen in transition. The Water Dogs last week against the Cannons did allow some opportunities in transition and allowed some quick offense to occur against them. So I think that Earhart there, if those issues by the Water Dogs defense haven't been addressed, you could see a guy like Earhart produce at a high level in terms of some fantasy production. Trevor Baptiste as my faceoff, I think again, similar to Jeff Teat, this is a guy that week in and week out, I don't think you can necessarily go wrong with as your fantasy pick there, because even on his off day, he's going to produce at a pretty high level for you. And then Blaze Reardon, again at tier 2, I'm kind of surprised he checked in this week as a tier 2 goalie. So I obviously had to go with him there because, again, just as I've said multiple times now, even on his off day, he's still going to get you 10 plus saves in a game, and there's a lot of value that brings in terms of player royale. So now getting to the picks here in week 2 in the PLL, 3-1 after week 1, the picks 0-4. I hopped on Stevie Mac Media at Stevie Mac Media on Twitter to do these polls, so you can go ahead each week, usually probably about Wednesday or Thursday. I like to put those out so you can check those out each week to make your picks. So in game 1 against the Chrome and the Redwoods, Chrome come in 1-0, Redwoods 0-1. I like the Chrome in this game on DraftKings. They're plus 130. The polls will take the Redwoods with 60% of the vote. So again, some differences here in the picks each week. I tried to pick at least one underdog each week. So last week I went with the Chrome. The Chrome again here in week 2 are one of my picks. I have another one coming up in just a second. But my bonus pick for this game, I looked at DraftKings. I'm not much of a bettor, I'll admit. I've never even placed a bet in my life, but this is something that I want to do with the podcast moving forward, just to have a little bit extra fun with doing these picks each and every week. So my bonus pick in this game is Jules Heningberg over 2.5 points. He was really productive a week ago. I had him on my player royale team, did really well for me a week ago with 4 goals. So I really like against the Chrome. I really like, especially with Sergio Perkovic out of the lineup this weekend, I like Jules Heningberg over 2.5 points. Game number 2, the Chaos 0-1 against the Archers, also 0-1. This one, I got the Chaos again. They're one of my underdogs this week, plus 140 there. The polls at 66.7% of the vote will take the Archers. My bonus in this game is Mac O'Keefe over 1.5 points is minus 160 there. And this was something that Dan Arestia said on Twitter when these lines came out, is when you really think about it, with Mac O'Keefe at 1.5 points, all he has to do is hit a 2-bomb and you already hit the 1.5 over. So I like Mac O'Keefe on the over there. The next game, the Atlas 1-0 against the Cannons, also 1-0. I'm going to stick with my guys. I'm taking the Atlas minus 210. The polls as well with 77.8% of the vote, which was the highest percentage of the vote this week for any of these games. We'll also take the Atlas in this one. My bonus here, I've got a couple that I liked here. I like the over 24.5. That's something that I mentioned in segment 1. Take the over 24.5 at minus 130. And I also like the Cannons plus 2.5 at minus 145. If you go back and look at those 3 matchups between these teams a year ago, the Atlas were plus 2 in score differential per game in those 3 games against the Cannons all time. So I like the over 24.5 and the Cannons plus 2.5 there. And then the final game, the Whipsnakes 1-0 against the Water Dogs 0-1. My pick, I've got the Whipsnakes minus 110. The polls at 55.6% of the vote take the Whipsnakes as well. So again, I believe it was last week you saw not too much of a gap between taking the Whipsnakes and whoever they were going up against. But the polls take the Whipsnakes as well. My bonus here is Mike Chanenchuk over 1.5 points, minus 155. He had that hat trick a week ago against the Chaos, so I like him and his playmaking ability and what we saw from him a week ago. I like him to go over 1.5 in this game. To finish things off in segment 3, coming up on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, we'll get your thoughts in the mix heading into week 2 in PLL action, but you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Welcome back. Final segment here on a Thursday on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, leading into week 2 in the Premier Lacrosse League. This weekend, games on Friday and Saturday. Get your thoughts here to round out the show. At Stevie Mac Media, again, is my Twitter handle for all show and lacrosse related content, topics, and discussion. From Coach Shrek, he says, game-wise, I'm curious to see what sort of strategy the Archers will implement at the Faceoff X with Justin Inacio unable to travel. Will rookie faceoff specialist Frank Labetti be able to step up? Yeah, that's something that when you talk about some of these matchups this weekend, that's going to be something that I think is interesting to watch for, is how they handle that situation at the stripe. But one thing that you see from teams is they have the ability to get their wings involved and tie up on those face-offs and get their wings involved to try and win some extra face-offs here and there. I think that's something that the Chaos does really well, and I think that's something that, if needed in a game such as this, when you're without essentially your top guy in Inacio, that you can definitely do that. So yeah, just like Shrek says, it'll be interesting to see how they try to play that from a strategy or schematic standpoint. He says also, will the Redwoods offense be able to find some sort of rhythm with Sergio Perkovic doubtful for this weekend? Defensively, will they continue to run Arden Cohen at LSM to give Kyle Hartzell a breather? So yeah, just to focus on that part about Sergio Perkovic, I mentioned before, it's probably going to come down to a guy like Nakai Montgomery getting more run from the midfield. They're going to put the ball in his cross a little bit more and have him go out and try to make some plays and be a more of a contributing factor on offense to replace some of that. I think Henningberg is another guy that I really like them leaning a little bit more on this week, especially after his performance a week ago without that guy like Sergio Perkovic in the lineup. So yeah, it's just now with him out, everybody else kind of has to step up just a little bit more to try and replace that production that's lost by a guy like Perkovic being out. He says, lastly, can the Atlas continue to put up big points against Nick Morocco in Cage? And yeah, I think that, like I said, when discussing this game earlier in this episode, this is one of those more interesting matchups because it's one that could either be extremely high scoring or it can be a hard-fought defensive battle on the defensive end with the goalies just making some ridiculous saves to shut out these two really high-powered offenses, essentially. So it'll be interesting to see at which end of the field is this game won or lost. And I think that a lot of that also has to do with the battle at the stripe between Stephen Kelly and Trevor Baptiste. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch for as well in that game. From Michael Grine, he says, I think this will be a weekend of close games. Chrome Woods and Archer's Chaos could be low scoring, and Cannon's Atlas could turn into a wild shootout. So yeah, just like I said before, this weekend of games is really hard to pick. It was hard for me, even last segment, deciding who I wanted to go with in each game. And even if you look at the betting lines, they're, at least in my mind, they're extremely close. So it's really hard to decide who to go with this weekend because you could see really any of the four matchups going either way. You could see the Atlas win big or win close, or you could see the Cannons win big or win close, just as an example. Like it's just so hard to tell how some of these games are going to play out. So we'll just have to see how they do play out here this weekend. And then from Brian, he says, what Woods team will we see? The D looked off and they are playing a strong Chrome team. The Atlas Chrome, I'm assuming he meant Atlas Cannons here, is my game of the week. Can Lyle and the Cannons continue their success when the D is playing well and they are facing off at 50%? This team is scary. Yeah, and I think that's something that you could say about the Water Dogs as well in terms of what version of them are we going to see. I think it's the Redwoods, the Chrome, and the Cannons are what kind of team are we going to see this week? Does the Chrome continue their solid play from a week ago here in week 2? Does the Woods defense step up again here in week 2 and shake off their performance against a really hard offense to match up with in the Atlas? And how does the Cannons come out this week after lighting it up against the Water Dogs a week ago? So yeah, I think, and you could even say that about the Chaos too. How do they shake off that tough loss to the Whip Snakes? And now that they've got guys like Stotts and Westberg back this week, how different do they look here in week 2? So yeah, it's just, this is a really tough week, I would say, in terms of picking a winner in these matchups, because they can go any which way possible. But it was definitely fun going through that in segment 2 and figuring out who I liked there and seeing who the polls as well liked in some of those games. But that will do it for Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, heading into week 2 in Premier Lacrosse League action. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. Also leave a comment and review on Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate it. You can listen to the podcast just about anywhere you get your podcasts now, including Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and now Stitcher is the latest and greatest to the lineup of platforms that the show is now on, so you can find it there as well. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.